This is Amersham, the end of the Metropolitan line. But it wasn't always. Let's take a brief tour of the history of this station. Amersham Station dates back to 1892 and was opened by the Metropolitan Railway. But Amersham was just a stop on the way to the line's ultimate endpoint, which was Aylesbury. At Aylesbury it would meet the Great Western Railway and a line called the Aylesbury and Buckingham Railway. The latter had actually been taken over by the Met in 1891. In those days, the Metropolitan had ambitions far beyond being an underground railway. Or rather, the chairman, Sir Edward Watkin, did. Looking ahead, the plan was to get to Buckingham and Oxford. Further ahead, to Manchester. It's even been theorised that Watkin wanted to get all the way to Paris, but this is much debated by serious railway historians and hacks on YouTube alike. When Watkin retired in 1894, though, the other Metropolitan directors decided that while these ambitious schemes were nice and all, there wasn't really a future in them. The Metropolitan had always had this identity crisis, with some shareholders thinking they should stick to short-distance commuter trains, and others thinking they should play with the big boys. Anyway, from 1894 the Met calmed down. When Amersham was built, it was out in the countryside. In fact, the station was some distance from the town of Amersham as it stood then, but that was hardly unusual for railways in those days, whose naming policies for stations verged on false advertising. In those days, Amersham was firmly out in the countryside, and the Metropolitan would advertise it as a fine place to go rambling. As in, walking, not talking endlessly about underground stations or whatever. Amersham wasn't just an underground station. It's also on the Chiltern line out of Marylebone. That dates back to 1899. The Chiltern line was the brainchild of a company called the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway, which was another line in which Watkin had an interest. It was originally considered that the Metropolitan and the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire would merge, but the Met shareholders weren't confident about the MSLR's ability to get their railway built. The company's nickname was the Money Sunk and Lost. Instead, the MSLR built their own line into a new terminus at Marylebone, using the Metropolitan route for part of the journey. In 1897, the MSLR was renamed the Great Central Railway, which was felt to be more fitting now. In 1899, the line was completed, and Amersham became a jointly owned station between the Met and the Great Central. The presence of a railway brought development to Amersham. The Metropolitan Railway encouraged development along their route. In fact, they even got into the property business themselves, using their surplus land acquired during construction to build housing estates. They created the marketing device of Metroland, which offered Londoners the tempting opportunity to live out in the countryside, yet be within easy reach of the capital. I mean, in practice it didn't really work like that, and mostly what passengers got was more suburbs. But anyway. In 1922 the station's name was changed to Amersham and Chesham Bois, reflecting the fact that nearby Chesham Bois had also begun to see development. In 1937 it changed back. Amersham is nearly 24 miles from the centre of London, so when the Met were running things, this meant that the place saw express trains, often hauled by the elegant H-class. Slow trains were typically pulled by the E-class, and in Amersham there's a 1/3 scale model of one of these trains, which I rather like. Being out in the countryside, there was a certain amount of goods traffic for the city, particularly agricultural produce. Amersham used to have its own goods yard to deal with it. The Metropolitan Railway electrified its first section in 1905, but it would take a long time for the juice to reach Amersham. In 1925 it would get to Rickmansworth, but beyond that the electric locomotive would have to hand over to a steamer for the rest of the journey. In 1923 the Great Central ceased to exist, becoming part of the London and North Eastern Railway. In 1933 the Metropolitan, despite their protests, became an official part of the London Underground, under the London Passenger Transport Board. The new owners began planning improvements. The New Works programme, published in 1935, announced the extension of electrification to Aylesbury. But then the Second World War happened, and that resulted in most of the improvements to the network being put on hold. In 1948, another change of ownership for the Chiltern Line, when the London and North Eastern Railway was nationalised and became part of British Railways. Electricity finally got to Amersham in 1960. By this time, the outer reaches of the Metropolitan line had become a distinct oddity on a network that specialised in modern urban mass transit. Steam locomotives hauling wooden coaches to towns far outside of London was not exactly what London transport was formed to deal with. In 1961, the last steam-hauled passenger train ran, and thereafter the underground service was cut back to Amersham, as it still is today. The modernised line came with purpose-built trains, the A60 and A62 stock. The A, in fact, stands for Amersham. They were in service well into this century. I always rather liked them. They had a steam-age feel. The 1960s were not a good time for the British railway network. The former Great Central Railway was mostly closed under the infamous Beeching Axe. The Chiltern Line, though, was retained. Not that BR liked it, they'd definitely have closed it if they could justify it. But they didn't, and a good thing too, as passenger numbers have increased over the decades. It's become a very useful commuter route, in fact. However, in 1966, Amersham lost its goods yard. BR didn't see any future in the old concept of the goods train, with a few wagons being picked up here and there. Amersham has seen plenty of modernisation over the years, but physically it's still the country station it was built as. The Metropolitan Railway architecture is fully on show. It's the second most northerly station on the underground network and the highest above sea level. Despite being built as a country station, out in what must have seemed like the middle of nowhere to Londoners, it's now a busy and well-used station with excellent connections to the city. Which isn't quite what Edward Watkin was hoping for, but you have to admit it's pretty good. Well, I hope you enjoyed this distinctly unmetropolitan tale from the tube. If so, I'd be very grateful if you took the A-train to the like button and perhaps considered subscribing for more. I'd also like to express my gratitude to my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon and here on YouTube. You are the locomotive to my wooden coaches. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.